participate. I mentioned a little bit earlier as we were starting, people were starting to filter in that this is definitely the silver lining of this period, is that we have learned to have these kind of meetings and communicate with each other through the Zoom era that we're living through, and get to meet people that I probably wouldn't have had the chance to meet otherwise. So thank you. I think this is quite a time to be alive, and it's quite a time in particular to be a radical and a socialist. I think just the scale of the crisis that we're up against is really unprecedented. It's kind of a perfect storm of public health, economic, ecological, and racial crises, which are completely entangled and inseparable, of course. And so it's sort of a contradictory situation where on the one hand, things are quite, bleak and often terrifying. I was saying earlier that I'm based, Simon mentioned, I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. In the spring, it was just basically nonstop ambulances and, just in the throes of some very scary times. And completely mishandled by our government as well as your government and others. But on the other hand, while in some ways things have been bleak, on the other hand, I think there are some real opportunities for the left that haven't existed, certainly in the U.S. In generations. And I'd be curious to hear about how things look in the UK. In the US, the left, we've always had a kind of jealousy of, almost every other left in every other country, because in the US, the left has been practically non-existent for a long time. And now it is. We have an explosion of an organization like DSA to almost 100,000 members. It was just a few thousand members a few years ago. We have the rise of these kind of radical Democrats, or whatever you might want to call them, but the Bernie Sanders and AOC and others. That there's a big hearing right now for socialist ideas, and literally thousands of people flocking to organizations. So I think this is a really important time to deepen our understanding of the system that we live in, and that's where Marxism, I think, comes in as a very useful tool. So the reason that I wrote my book is because I basically believe very strongly that the questions of how the system works, and therefore how our economy works within that, have to be in the hands of, regular people, of people like me and you, that in order for us to be able to make demands, make changes, and ultimately overturn the economic system, that we have to know what we're up against, right? There's no other situation where you would kind of willingly go into battle with an opponent that you don't know. Just like sports teams watch each other's games and like learn each other's plays and strengths and weaknesses, we're up against capitalism, which unfortunately is not just like another team that we're meeting on an equal playing field. It's a system that's entrenched and has incredibly powerful interests backing it, with an unprecedented amount of wealth and arms. So all the more reason, we have our powers too, of course, which maybe we can get into in the discussion, but that's all the more reason why we really need to understand the system, what makes it tick, its contradictions, its point of weaknesses, et cetera. And the assumption that the economy is just too hard for us to understand really benefits the status quo, right? And it's not a coincidence that we're told in a million different ways throughout our lives, understand the economy is not up to us. And that's the reason that I wrote my book, like I said, and it's the reason that I'm committed to participating in as many of these kind of conversations with other activists and socialists as possible, because I think, this is a really important moment when everything in our society is being exposed and scrutinized and challenged. So the other kind of element, and the reason that I wrote my book and I'm having these discussions, et cetera, is that I think one of the key goals for the socialist movement right now is to meet people where they're at, because not only thousands but millions of people are radicalizing around us, and so broad socialist aims are resonating with increasing numbers of people, but we need to deepen and develop the kind of analysis that is needed to understand the structures that we're up against. And I believe Marxism is the best tool to do that. Marxism isn't a blueprint, it's an analytical tool. And Marx's approach to economics is basically to delve beneath the surface of the appearance of things, beneath the kind of common sense, seemingly natural state of affairs where we're all supposedly equal players, buying and selling goods, selling our labor for a wage, to reveal beneath that the underlying economic laws of motion of the system. And at the heart of capitalism, beneath that kind of facade of equity, is a relationship of exploitation. So Marxist economics is about explaining capitalism as a system, right? It's not just a collection of individuals, and some of them happen to be greedier than others, but it's a system, it's a social structure made up of classes that have different material interests and that operate based on those material interests. So a basic definition of capitalism, right, is that it's a system of commodity production for sale on the market, but which is built on this social relationship of exploitation. Whereas mainstream economists talk about economics as numbers and prices and profits, Marxists understand economics as fundamentally about human beings and our relationships to each other and the planet. And at its best, when the capitalist economy is healthy by their standards, it depends on exploitation, poverty, oppression, environmental degradation in order to function. So, I'm not going to get too into some of these points for the sake of time, but the basis of that exploitation is that under capitalism, our ability to labor, what Marx calls our labor power, is a commodity. It's bought and sold for a wage on the labor market. And so what determines the value of our labor power, our ability to work, is what, in kind of Marxist jargon, what Marx called the labor theory of value, although he wasn't the first to do that. Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the classical economists also kind of understood labor as being the driver of what determines value. So what determines the value of our labor power, our ability to labor, which has become a commodity, is basically the total amount of labor time or value that's gone into our ability to wake up and go to work every day. The cost of shelter, education, food, clothes, etc. If you add all those things up together, the cost of labor roughly is paid out in a wage and is loosely, equal to the cost of keeping laborers living and reproducing our ability to go back to work the next day. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and there's much more to say about it. But for our purposes, I'll just say two things, which makes labor power different than any other commodity under capitalism. One is that labor power is a labor power of human beings, which makes it different. Unlike other commodities, the cost of our labor power is therefore socially conditioned, and you can say this both in a positive sense that, we're humans, therefore we have the ability to organize and fight for better wages through unions and other means. And it's also socially conditioned in the negative sense, right? That oppression drives down wages by disempowering us, making us desperate, whether through things like the threat of deportations or police violence and mass incarceration, the use of debt, etc. All these kind of means of oppression are used to make different sections of the working class more or less vulnerable to, desperate conditions that accept wages that are below their value, below the cost of sustaining ourselves and our ability to live and thrive and go back to work the next day. The second difference between labor power and other commodities is that labor power has a unique ability to create more value than it's worth. Marx called it the golden goose of capitalism. that, or the magical goose of capitalism that lays golden eggs for the capitalists. That basically what we're paid in terms of the value of our labor power, in terms of our wages, is very different than the fruits of our labor. So like, I don't know, do you guys have Starbucks in the UK? Yeah, okay. Because it's the example I often use in the US because it's very easy to kind of wrap your head around. But if you work for Starbucks, and in the US we have abysmally low minimum wage here. So let's say they would pay you $120 or like 90 pounds for the day, because that's what is determined will keep you able and willing to come back to work the next day. But it only takes you about 2 hours at Starbucks to reproduce, 90 pounds of fancy coffee, or $120 or whatever. So instead of going home after 2 hours because you've made back the amount of money that they have paid you in wages, you are stuck there for the remainder of your shift. And the other 6 hours, you're basically working for free and the bosses pocket the difference. And that's kind of the exploitation in a nutshell, right? So that's kind of a bare bones explanation of capitalism working at its healthiest state. But it's built on contradictions that can only be resolved through crises. And I want to just take a minute to talk about crises and Marxist theory of economic crisis, because I think that's particularly relevant at the moment, given the crisis that we're in. The way that Marx put it was, he said, crises are never more than momentary violent solutions for existing contradictions, violent eruptions that reestablish the disturbed balance for the time being. So Marx didn't develop a crisis theory in one cohesive place where we can then all read it and discuss it and decide, okay, this is what Marx said and meant. It's kind of in a smattering of different places. And there's a lot of debates among Marxists and radical economists about what are the different aspects of Marxist theory of crisis and which ones take precedent over others. And I'm not going to get into those debates now, although if people are interested, we can take that up more in discussion. You can also, if you're interested in that kind of question more, there's a website called wearemany.org that has a bunch of talks, and it includes one that I gave on debates on Marxist theory of crisis. But I think, the key point that I want to emphasize here is that the process of accumulating profits, capital accumulation, is itself inherently rife with contradictions. And so like a quick and dirty, explanation of what that means. First and foremost, we know that capital accumulation is driven not by profits, but it's driven by profits, not by human needs, right? So in Marxist jargon, Marx talks about, rather than capitalism caring about use values, it only cares about the realization of exchange values. So what he means by that, right, is that each commodity has a use value, what makes it useful, and an exchange value, what it exchanges for. So bread's use value is that you eat it, and its exchange value is that, you pay $5 for it. So there was a time when humans produced for themselves, and what society cared about was the use value of things, that you needed to have enough bread in order to eat. With capitalism, the main thing that capitalists care about is the exchange value. How much is bread selling for? There may be some kind of passionate small business people that care about, their company, what their company produces, but by and large, most corporations and the CEOs that run them couldn't care less if they were producing bread or cars or nuclear weapons, as long as they're making a profit off of selling them. That's what drives capitalism. And there are a few problems and contradictions that are inherent in this setup. For example, housing. We don't have just housing under capitalism, we have a housing market. what matters is the exchange value of how much you sell houses for, not who needs houses. So if we were to organize construction of housing on the basis of just housing people, like if we lived in a socialist society, you know, it could be an interesting challenge to figure out exactly how to do that, but it would be a very surmountable challenge to figure out how many people need houses, how do we marshal the right amount of materials and the people, labor, to make that happen. And that's how you would organize housing if it was based on the use values versus the exchange value of how much housing costs. So in capitalism, how you organize construction of housing is based on making money, right? So it's not who and how many people need houses, but what's effective demand, as capitalists call it. Who has the money to buy houses? How much are they willing to pay? How much debt can they take on to do it? And there's a lot of moving parts, right? On top of it, you have a lot of different companies competing with each other, not planning collectively how to organize to meet that need, because it's the accumulation of profit that drives decision-making and not use values for need. Demand doesn't actually drive supply. It's actually the reverse. Supply drives demand. You know, it's not that we have a housing market based on how many people need houses. So capitalist organization of the economy separates the processes of production, which are about kind of producing a profit, with the process of consumption, which is regulated through exchange on the market. When people produced for themselves, there were regular crises, right? But they were crises of underproduction. There wasn't enough being produced. Famines, wars, droughts. You know, these are brutal type of crises. This is not to idealize the past. But the basic equation of what society produced was driven by demand for those things. Under capitalism, every industry doesn't, you know, collectively take stock of the need, and more importantly for capital, the ability to pay for the goods that they produce. Rather, each company is concerned with expanding their individual share of the market. In order to do that, they have to drive down prices through increasing productivity. And so there's this constantly, you know, there's this constant like ceaseless drive to produce more efficiently, to reduce labor costs in order to drive down the prices of the goods that they're making, in order to get more market share. So they're constantly increasing the scale of production in order to gain that market share. And this leads, you know, when all the companies are doing that at once, to a greater volume of goods, right? So we have on the one hand, this kind of exploitation of labor when it's working as it should for the capitalist. It's constantly producing more and more wealth for the capitalist. On the other hand, a process of capitalist accumulation between the capitalists, which throws more and more commodities onto the marketplace, not for need, but for the further accumulation of profit. So we have this very unplanned drive for expansion that's constantly going on. It doesn't always succeed, but that's the underlying drive at play. And to add to the difficulties, even though the system is completely unplanned, it's also completely interconnected. So, you know, the oil industry doesn't plan within itself, but it certainly doesn't plan with the auto and steel industries. So what happens, you know, in one industry is completely connected and dependent on other industries. So if one goes out of whack with supply and demand, like we saw with oil, and we're still seeing with oil, it can easily kind of generalize into crises in other industries and kind of throw the rest of the system out of whack. So one of the main results of all of this is a boom and bust cycle, which again, there's a lot more to say about, and we can talk about more in discussion, but Marxists often call these crises crises of overproduction. Unlike in the past when we had crises that were largely about famines and droughts and underproduction, capitalism produces crises of overproduction, something that, Marx talked at great length about how just absurd and barbaric that is, that we have too much, and therefore people have to, completely suffer because there's too many commodities to be sold at a profit. But basically accumulation of production and of profits runs so far ahead and so fast that it could easily become detached from effective demand. And this is especially true when, businesses are constantly trying to lower labor costs, and it's harder for people to buy more and more goods. So this brings us to the current crisis, which I want to say just a few things about. First is that before the pandemic even hit, the global economy wasn't in great shape. Like the way that I think it's mostly talked about right now in the media, in some ways rightly so, like this is a coronavirus economic recession, and it is. It's been a complete and utter shock to the system. But it's been talked about as though, things were going well, and then they suddenly took a dip, and that's where like people talk about a V-shaped recovery. It's just like it started up here, it's tanked, and as soon as we get the pandemic under control, it'll jump right back up. So in the U.S., which the U.S. economy is one of the main drivers of the global economy, was headed towards a recession before the pandemic hit. In China, which has been, was really propping up international economic growth, was slowing down severely. Globally, the state of the economy was not in good shape. And on top of this already weakened economy, then we're delivered, this complete and unprecedented shock to the system. It's possible that, if it was the case that the economy was kind of on a healthy foundation to begin with, and the state, whether it's the U.S. state or the state in UK or others, were handling the pandemic with any amount of competence. Obviously, that's varied a lot throughout the world. In the US, we have won the trophy of the most incompetent handling of the pandemic, probably in the world. It would still be, even in that best case scenario, that the economy was in a healthy state and the pandemic was handled with competence, it would still be very difficult to rebound from such a shock to the system. But given where things were at, the one thing that we can say with total certainty is that the economic crisis is not going to rebound quickly. It's exposed all of the weaknesses of the economy, the slow growth that was going on before the pandemic, the unprecedented dependence on consumer and corporate debt to fuel consumption, the unprecedented dependence on low interest rates and injections from state banks to fuel investment. And then we got hit with, like I said, the severity of the shocks to both supply and demand. So, industry, services, transportation networks, we're all ground to a standstill. Energy, which is a common denominator across the economy, faced, a completely cratered demand. The oil industry, as a result, it was already in a crisis of overproduction, went into a total free fall, which then impacts, the rest of the economy. So when businesses go out of business, they can't just simply reopen once the pandemic is over. And that's especially the case if, as we're seeing in a number of countries, in mine as well as yours, countries kind of locking down, then reopening, then locking down again, because they actually haven't gotten things under control. But businesses basically have lost an incredible amount of revenue, have had to shut down entire stores, plants, operations, many of which can't simply just go back online for both logistical reasons and reasons of cash flow. So we're beginning to see, and mainstream economists are beginning to report on this as well, that, you know, things being businesses shutting down permanently and long-term unemployment, both of these statistics are going up. So we're seeing, you know, basically mass unemployment, heavily indebted populations. You know, to be unemployed and be in debt means that you have no savings and cushion. And in the US, of course, we have a non-existent social safety net and a completely hollowed out healthcare system. So that makes it very difficult to weather the storm. And ultimately, you know, one of the main problems of this economic crisis that does make it different than a lot of other crises is that so we have this kind of devastating pandemic and the economic fallout, and all of these things are just devastating from a basic human perspective. But it's also a problem for rebooting the economy, because ultimately the economy is not going to reboot until, you know, and flow more freely until the pandemic is under control. And our capitalism is just not a system that is very well suited to handle health problems. It's barely suited to deal with economic problems. But, you know, like in the US, they poured immediately trillions of dollars into the financial markets. That they could do with great speed, but to actually handle a health crisis has proven to be very difficult. Certainly for capitalism, and then even more so when you have somebody like Trump at the helm. But hospitals and states, so, you know, in the US, and I don't know as much about how this has gone on in the UK. In the US, the government let the free market rip in terms of handling the pandemic. So hospitals and states have been literally in bidding wars with each other for masks and ventilators. There's been no coordinated campaign of education and testing, let alone production and distribution of medical goods. And capitalism fundamentally can't handle doing what's actually needed to shut down the economy, to pay people for long enough to keep them at home, to actually stop the disease from spreading. The economy has to keep growing or it goes into a cardiac arrest. And that's something that's true regardless of whether you have someone as incompetent and is, you know, homicidal in office as Trump or not. That's true of capitalism in general. So I think, and I'll end here, that the framework for the coming years is going to be one in which the capitalist class is pushing for corporate bailouts and for them, and austerity for us in order to rebuild profitability. And labor and social movements are going to have to keep pushing, get better organized to fight for stimulus, economic relief, and ultimately, you know, for remaking the economy along different lines, you know, along the lines that, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, the Green New Deal and what kind of a sustainable economy we need moving forward. We're likely headed towards a deep and protracted economic crisis around the world. And that's going to provide the underlying context for labor, social, and economic battles ahead. On the one hand, you know, it will lead and has already created incredibly desperate situations and urgent struggles. At the same time, it means that capitalism has been exposed not to just like the thousands, but to the millions. And so for people on the left and for socialists, I think it means that we really need to broaden our horizons, right? The future direction of our economy and our society will be determined by the struggles ahead in the coming months and years. And within that, I think we can put forward a much broader vision of what's possible and what's necessary.
Okay, Hadas, thank you very much for that. If anyone wants to come in and contribute to the discussion, either by asking a question or making a short statement that I just asked for it to be on topic and respectful of everyone. That's fine. Or if you do want to ask a question in the chat, do feel free to do that as well. Just picking up on a couple of the points there. You know, we've just recently in this country seen one of our big retail groups go into or enter administration, which is the Arcadia Group, and originally that was or still is run by Philip Green, who lives on a yacht in the south of France, and he got in trouble with our Parliament for the way that he dealt with the pension scheme at another one of his businesses that he sold for £1 to a known crook, it's just interesting that the Arcadia Group, a traditional bricks and mortar clothes shopping empire, has gone into an administration, and the companies that are doing well are the online retailers like Boohoo and ASOS, who have recently, I think it was Boohoo that was found to be running sweatshops in this country, for you know, in the production of its clothes, supposedly unbeknown to the company itself. So we definitely are you know, suffering from a crisis of capital, and also you know, we're currently going through a bit of a PPE scandal in this country, where the Conservative government, friends and family of ministers and Conservative MPs were getting contracts to provide PPE, even though they'd never had any dealings with either sourcing or producing PPE, and I think that's going to be a huge scandal in the coming months, and probably going into next year when the full story does come out. Zbigniew, you've got your hand raised, so if you'd like to come in, unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I wonder if you read Michael Roberts' review on his blog of your book, Hadas, because he praises it very much, but has the criticism of the question of supply, the lack of demand being the main motor force for the crises, whereas he argues for the fact that the falling rate of profit that is outlined in Capital 1 and 3 is the main thing, and he calculates this for various economies over the past 30, 40, 50 years, and he shows the various graphs of over the past 200 years of capitalism coinciding with the long waves and the lack of investment that goes with falling rate of profit. So how do you answer those kind of criticisms? Would be a nice thing to develop if you could. Thank you.
Do you want me to take a couple of questions to that, and then you come back in, if that's okay?
Sure, however you want to.
Yeah, Dave, if you want to unmute yourself and come in next.
Yeah. Hi. Very good, very interesting, very clear introduction, by the way. I enjoyed it. Following on what Simon was saying about the Arcadia Group and the collapse of the various retail companies, it was very interesting. I listened to, for some reason, I was able to listen to and see Starmer's question, Prime Minister's questions on this issue, and it's very interesting because it shows you the complete problem we have, if you like, with the Labour Party, Labour leadership, left or right, because his main response was really, Mr. Johnson, what are you going to do to help these people? There was no counter plan. There was no measures that the Labour movement was putting forward to deal with the crisis. Like, you know, in France, for example, they have a line that's raised by the left, which is to ban any redundancies. In Italy too, funnily enough, at the moment, there's a ban on any redundancies, and that's been accepted by the government for the moment. Obviously, that will change. So there was no real alternative put forward by Keir. I think one of the big problems we have, if you like, with the Corbyn movement, you could say that although John McDonnell, was a very interesting book that came out, John McDonnell did on drawing up a whole series of policies for a left government when it looked like Corbyn had a chance of becoming the next government. They put forward some some good proposals. You could argue that lots of the demands they put forward were transitional demands. They were demands which posed the question of challenging capital, but they weren't revolutionary in terms of setting up a new worker state or anything like that, but they were very positive ideas. So there is some, we have got some ground, there is something out there that we can work on. But overall, I would argue that one of the problems with organising, particularly with those big mass upsurges which are reflected in mass parties like the Corbyn movement, we have to work much stronger at developing this Marxist analysis. I mean, I think that's one of the big differences, if you like, between the radicalisation that we went through when we were in the 70s, young people in the 70s. There was more or less, among young people, the students, a sort of acceptance of basic ideas of Marxism, if you like, in a very general sense, okay? And anti-imperialism, for that matter. Today's young people, they're very strong on ecology and stuff like that, which is great, but not necessarily accepting sort of, they have not a grounding for all sorts of reasons, you know, in the Marxist thing. I wonder if you comment on that. The other point I want to make is that the big thing we've got to integrate now is ecology, I think, and the fact that any Marxist analysis has got to rework itself within that framework. So things like growth, we're not in favour of growth, I don't think now. We're in favour of degrowth or a very minimal sustainable economy. And I think there's a very interesting thing came out the other day, an official report, I think, not from some radical left think tank, but an official report from the UN or somewhere, saying that advertising was deeply anti-ecological because advertising just continually stimulates people to buy stuff. And this is really useful stuff, showing that there's a direct link between the advertising industry and the economic and ecological disaster of industry. So I think these are all important things we should look at. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Hadas, would you like to come in on those two comments?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Let me see if I can start at the end and work my way back. I think, yeah, on the question of ecology and growth, absolutely. I think, you know, there's interesting debates about the question of growth versus degrowth. And I think, you know, some of the degrowth stuff can get a little bit tricky in terms of, you know, we do live in an industrial society and we have, as a society, developed an ability to sustain the kind of population that we have. Of course, we don't do it under capitalism because it's not, that growth is not used towards meeting human need. And it's also completely, you know, done in contradiction to ecological sustainability. It's not even that it's not enough of a priority, but it's like the opposite of a priority, right? The world resources are basically economic inputs into the production process. That's how they're seen. And I think, you know, if we had a society that was based on a democratic organization of the economy, democratic planning, and based on human needs versus profit, you would first of all get rid of the entire, you know, arms industry. You know, the Pentagon in the United States is the #1 polluter in the world. You would, by getting rid of the Pentagon, already eliminate, I don't remember the percentage, but a very high percentage of carbon emissions and pollution and et cetera. You know, I absolutely agree about advertising. You know, this is both a complete waste of human labor, and it is, yeah, an ecologically unsustainable industry for the reasons that you said. So I absolutely agree. And I think there's a lot of interesting discussion and writing about that right now. And I think it's worth saying, and I actually have a sidebar in my book about it, that Marx and Engels were, I think, misinterpreted on the question of growth because they did kind of celebrate the productive capacity of capitalism. You know, despite the fact that they said they very much obviously critiqued the basis on which that production happened and towards whose benefit. But they also had, you know, they were celebrating the potential that exists within that, rather than celebrating just the sake, celebrating growth for the sake of growth. They were celebrating that within that is the potential, if society was organized in a different way, to actually take care of the entire world's population, that we have that potential that we never had before historically. And then in some of what I raise in the sidebar in the book, it's just a glimpse really of some of Marx and Engels' writing, but they had a lot to say on the question of ecology, actually, and about how capitalism runs counter to it. On the question of Marxism, class politics, in obviously in every country, and the history of the left is different in every country. So I can really speak to the experience in the U.S., but I would be curious to hear more about your all's experience in the U.K. But I will say in the U.S. that I was saying earlier before we started the talk, I've been in the socialist left for over 20 years, basically my whole adult life, and there has been a very marked shift in terms of the appeal of socialist politics, and in particular class politics within that. That just wasn't the case just a few years ago. It's certainly in the last 10 years since the Great Recession has increased a lot. And then, people like Bernie Sanders and the politicians that have kind of come up under his wings have helped to popularize those ideas. But I would say, as somebody who's organized as a socialist for a long time, that even though those ideas are not like the common sense ideas in a lot of ways of a new radicalization, that has shifted a lot, and that there is a real, there is a real pull towards understanding society along class lines. This is not about patting myself on the back, because it's not about how particularly well written or not well written the book is, but it is interesting to me that the book that I've written, People's Guide to Capitalism, it's called An Introduction to Marxist Economics, has sold out within its first 2 months of being printed. It was the highest seller on the ebook, Haymarket's ebooks sales. And I mean, I'm not saying this to pat my own back, although it's a little whatever. But it's interesting to me that a book with that title, that explicitly is about Marxist economics, would do particularly well at this moment. So I do think that there's a big opening, and I'll see if I can say briefly, without getting into I think it would be an interesting kind of talk and discussion in of itself about the debates in Marxist crisis theory. And I don't know, for people that do have my book, I do devote a chunk of time to discuss it in the chapter on economic crisis. But basically, how to sum it up. I agree with Michael Roberts that, and I should preface all of this by saying I have a tremendous amount of respect for Michael Roberts. He's an incredibly important and useful, made very useful contributions to Marxist economics. And I agree with him that it's not a lack of demand that is the key driver of economic crisis. And there's sort of an important difference between the Marxist theory of overproduction, which is a lot of what I discuss in my book, and then the theory of underconsumption. Even though they sound like flip sides of the same coin, they're actually a little bit different, which is that the theory of underconsumption that Michael Roberts argues against, and I agree with him on, is that it's not just that there's a lack of demand and that workers are constantly underpaid, and that's why they can't keep up with the growing supply, because capitalism is constantly growing and constantly putting more goods on the market, like I described, because it's not just working class people's demand that drives capitalism. It's actually, by and large, other corporations. Corporations buy from each other, like car companies have to buy steel, have to buy rubber, like and there becomes a kind of self-arming frenzy when corporations are buying from each other. And that's a big part of what drives capitalist economy forward. And so it's really insufficient to say there's this gap between, wages diminishing and production constantly forging ahead, because that's just not the whole of the economy, is working class demand. So that I absolutely agree with him on. I think that what the theory of overproduction and what I tried to emphasize in my book kind of emphasizes more is that production, that there is a constant, drive to produce more and more, that it's completely unplanned, that it happens in ways that throws off proportionality between the different industries, and it's a fundamentally unstable environment. Now, it doesn't mean that, it means it lays the potential for crises to emerge. Now, what actually sets off each crisis, I would argue, is any number of different things. And sometimes it is falling profitability, and sometimes it is falling demand, and sometimes it's like we're seeing right now, like severe shocks to the system. And so what I argue is more that you have to actually use the various tools that Marx laid out and apply them to different crises. I am not totally compelled by, I've seen Michael's data and the way that he tracks this kind of short and long booms, and I think there's some problems within there, and I'm not going to get too deeply into it, but I would just say that I think that the Marxist theory and of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is an important theory, but my main argument is that it's not a be-all end-all, that there's enough, Marx talks a lot about all the countervailing tendencies. There's a tendency, I'll just say this in brief, the theory of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is that because capitalists are constantly trying to lower the cost of production by lowering labor costs, that the amount that gets invested into labor versus the amount that gets invested into machinery and technology, et cetera, that ratio is constantly falling, so that capitalists have to invest more and more and have less and less labor going into the production process. And labor, as we talked about, is what creates new value. And so in a nutshell, what that means is that there's a tendency for profitability to fall because there's less and less labor being invested in relative to overall investment. However, Marx talked a lot about all the countervailing tendencies, the things that that mean that it's not just like a a slide to zero, because obviously capitalism wouldn't exist if that was the case, but that those countervailing tendencies counteract the extent to which profitability is dropping. Now, there's two different ways to look at it, to maybe oversimplify a little bit. One is, I think, the way that Michael Roberts does, which is that there's a falling profitability, and then there's countervailing tendencies, and those kind of lead to a boom and slump. I think that they occur too simultaneously for that to be an effective means of analyzing it. That they happen simultaneously, and what happens is that it creates a constant drag on the system. And again, like similar to the crisis of overproduction that I mentioned, they create a framework of instability. They create, for instance, the need for companies to constantly scale up production. And so bigger and bigger companies, a centralization and concentration of capitalism, as Marx talked about it. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going on too long, but all that to say that in my view, it's a constant drag on the system, and it's not, to me, an effective tool for analyzing all of the booms and busts of the system, which I think have a lot more going on to talk about.
Thank you. I've popped Michael's review of Hadas's book in the chat there if anyone wants to see that. So I'll take Simon and then I'm going to take Neil. So Simon, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, yeah, I thought that was a very interesting series of points you just made, Hadas. I think, just very quickly on the whole underconsumption versus overproduction thing. I mean, the problem for those left economists that do have an underconsumptionist view, in other words, wages have collapsed, or there's, very serious unemployment, people can't afford to buy like retail goods, for instance, then that kind of, causes shockwaves through the system. The problem with that analysis is that, of course, really it leads to just very reformist conclusions, because the conclusion then is kind of Keynesianism, just increase wages, kind of like artificially pump prime employment levels and so on in order to create aggregate demand. And I think that, there's a very important point that Marx makes in volume 3 of Capital, where he says that kind of underconsumption exists as a moment within the cycle of crisis. So it's not that it's the cause of it, but of course, there is a moment when there is the capitalist crisis, as you describe it, which then has an impact on employment levels and wages and so on, and then that feeds into the loop and exacerbates and deepens the crisis. It's very interesting, actually, like on the news in the UK. The kind of journalists who are meant to be the economics correspondents, they're obsessed with retail expenditure around Christmas. Like anyone who watches that, like say the BBC News, they obsessively talk about high street spending and whether it's going to go up, whether it's going to go down, or whether it's like increasing or decreasing. And of course, that also basically comes from a kind of underconsumptionist view of capitalism, that the real problem is that people are saving and not spending, or people aren't kind of pounding the streets and going out to the shops enough and buying things, and this is what's going to cause some kind of crisis. So I think it's very important to kind of challenge that kind of underconsumptionist kind of view, because I do think that it does then lead to kind of social democratic Keynesian politics, not to anti-capitalist politics, not to revolutionary socialist politics, but kind of policy agendas which just try and promote wages, and so on as the way of solving the crisis. A point I just want to make very quickly, which I guess is more of a question because I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. I think it's about the ideological power of capitalism. You said at the end of your introduction, Hadas, that there's kind of a kind of capitalist crisis, and kind of workers are kind of being exposed to the crisis, and there's kind of growing unemployment and so on. Certainly that's a feature of British capitalism now, but yet the ideological underpinnings of capitalism are incredibly strong, and workers do not spontaneously develop anti-capitalist consciousness, and if anything, they kind of spontaneously develop this kind of reformist consciousness. And now we've had the failure of Bernie Sanders in the US and the failure of Corbynism in the UK. So I guess I'd be interested to know where you think that leaves socialists and socialist arguments now, especially in the context of the environmental crisis that other people have been talking about, mentioned in the chat as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Neil?
This is all very interesting because by a strange coincidence, we have been working on a very short paper on economics, which is about to be published in next few days. And I'm definitely going to send Hadas the link when it crops up, because I'm very much more on her side than on Michael Roberts' side, and it's very naughty, really, of Zbigniew to raise the whole question of the falling rate of profit, which is a terribly sort of difficult technical thing, of course. Let me just say, I think it's completely and absolutely false. The paper will explain why And interesting too, worth saying this, that Simon and I disagree completely about this. Although we work incredibly closely together politically, we are poles apart on the nature of the economic crisis. And that's a good thing, because we're both involved in the ACR, and we want the ACR to be full of lots of live debate. But what I would say is this: you see, it's absolutely correct in my view to say that capitalism is suffering from a long-term crisis, actually, not just a short-term crisis of overproduction, but a long-term crisis of overaccumulation, the other side of which is a crisis of underconsumption. They're basically two sides of the same coin. And that's an alternative explanation to the declining rate of profit explanation. They're actually different explanations. They're quite radically different explanations, because either there's too much profit, the system is overloaded with profit that can't find a satisfactory investment outlet, or it's a problem of low profits. Now, it can't be both at the same time. We have to actually decide whether we're going to try and explain the crisis of capitalism in terms of declining profits, or we're going to explain it in terms of over accumulation. And it seems to me that without an understanding of the crisis as a crisis of over accumulation, we cannot explain neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is a way of trying to dump, a way of trying to offload huge quantities of capital in all sorts of pathological and parasitic ways, through financialization, through debt, through the privatization of the commons, through monopoly pricing, through channeling tax revenues, which of course come from workers ultimately, into militarized accumulation, and all kinds of things like this. Neoliberalism is a pathological response to the long-term crisis of overaccumulation, because they can't actually invest all of that surplus capital in the development of production, because they haven't got a market for the level of production that would then come on stream. And that's why we have, on a global scale, an unprecedented social crisis. We've been talking about Britain and the United States. It's worth saying this, that we're now in a period in the development of the system where virtually everybody on the planet is now part of the working class. The old peasantry has largely disappeared, and you have what Mike Davis calls a planet of slums. The social crisis of mass urbanization, what that's done is it's created a working class, only about a third of which has proper, permanent, relatively secure jobs, another third of which is working precariously, and another third of which, we're talking about something in the region of 2 billion people altogether now, is surplus humanity. To use Mike Davis's term, which has been picked up by William I. Robinson, surplus humanity. In other words, there is no work for them within the system at all, and they're existing or subsisting somehow in the informal sector. You just can't explain the crisis of the system today, this crisis of overaccumulation, the pathologies of neoliberalism, and the social crisis of massive levels of unemployment and underemployment and impoverishment, by falling back on this mystical idea that there's a long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It just doesn't stack up.
Thank you, Neil. Hadas, would you like to come back in on either of those two comments?
Sure. Well, I'll say I don't want to go much further in the debate about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, although I see it's a good and lively debate here, which is a good thing. I agree. I don't think there's anything, you know, there's not a Marxist principle at stake that says you have to argue this or the other. It's as I was saying earlier on, Marxism isn't meant to be a blueprint. It's an analytical tool. And I think, you know, one thing that the socialist left has been challenged with over the years, and I say that as somebody who's been in various, you know, whether you want to call them sectarian groups or not, depending on your perspective, that we, you know, basically argue against each other as like, if you don't agree with my analysis, you're not a Marxist kind of thing. So it's good. I'm excited to see that there's healthy debate around this question. I do agree, and I think that the outcome of neoliberalism has not been a declining profitability. It's been increased profitability, and I do think that what we've seen certainly over the last 10 to 20 years is various manifestations of that kind of overaccumulation and overproduction. The only reason I would say that I don't think the analysis and the theories of a tendency for rate of profit to fall versus overproduction and overaccumulation, the only reason I think they're not completely counterposed is that I do think that some of these things do go on at the same time. And what I was saying earlier is that in my view, that the tendency for the rate of profit to fall does function, it does go on, but it as more as an underlying kind of drag in the system that are just, you know, capitalists have to counteract the fact that there is a pull against profitability, and they counteract it in various ways. And it's part of what makes the system particularly exploitative. It's part of what makes the system constantly chase, you know, profits throughout the world, looking for cheaper labor elsewhere. It's part of what drives imperialism, and so on. So I do think, in my view, that it is an important dynamic to analyze. I'm just not of the view that it is the driver of booms and busts in our economy. The other thing that I want to say, you know, is this question of anti-capitalist consciousness versus reformist consciousness, and it gets back to an earlier question that I think actually that I missed, that I forgot about. You know, which is, you know, what should the socialist left and the radical left be proposing as solutions around the current crisis? And I think those questions are connected. I think that it's the main thing that I want to say here is that I think, you know, there's a difference between reformism as a vision and a goal, and reformism as in the fight for reforms that we desperately need, that we need to be able to kind of chew gum and walk at the same time, to have revolutionary ideals and vision and fight like hell for reforms that are necessary. And part of what that means is, like, you know, in the US, one of the big debates in official politics is the question of stimulus spending and economic relief, which has dragged on for months and months. You know, we had an initial stimulus bill in the spring that had, you know, problematic in certain ways, but also really parts of it that were incredibly important and helped to keep millions of people from falling into poverty. That a lot of those things have since lapsed, and some of those benefits are about to expire this month. And people are in desperate situations. And so on the one hand, it's true that out of that comes a reformist consciousness, right? That we need reforms, we need economic relief, we need, you know, heightened unemployment benefits, we need, you know, direct payments, we need free universal health care. All of those things are very much necessary to get people through this crisis. And those are reforms, and you could say that that's a reformist consciousness. On the other hand, all of those reforms run counter to profitability. And that's where, you know, Keynesianism and revolutionary Marxism, I think, differ, is that understanding that the reason that the capitalists are fighting tooth and nail against having you know, more economic relief is because it does undermine profitability. And the reason that there's this drive to reopen the economies all the time rather than just paying people to stay home until we've got the pandemic under control, is because profits are suffering. And so part of the fight for reforms exposes those questions. It exposes that the system is more interested in getting people back to work, in throwing people back into like the meat in the US, like the meat packing industry has been, just utterly, insanely unsafe, and people, have been getting COVID, and people have died, and they've insisted on pushing people back into work, not because there's like, this, insatiable need for meat, but because of profits. So there's a million examples of that, but I think that is actually driving both the common sense and the correct impulse towards reforms, at the same time that it opens up questions of revolutionary politics and why it is that that profits are standing against health and are being prioritized as against our health and lives.
Thank you, Hadas. We've probably got time for a couple of quick contributions. If anyone who hasn't asked a question yet would like to, one of our female comrades, if they do want to come in, please do raise your hand. So yeah, we've probably got about another 10 minutes or so. I've just got a quick question that kind of, it came up on social media, where in this country, we had a diktat come out from the government regarding the teaching of capitalism, or anti-capitalism, and that it should be teachers shouldn't be allowed to teach such things. And someone asked about whether there was a suitable book for primary school children, which is those under 10, to teach them about Marxism. And I just wondered whether what your thoughts are on kind of teaching younger children about Marxism. And is there anyone else that wants to come in for a short contribution? Okay, so what's your thoughts on teaching even younger children about Marxian economics?
Well, that's an excellent question, and one that goes that speaks to my heart. I don't know if I said this or how many people here are parents, but I'm a parent of a 4-year-old, and that is my along with socialism, my other great passion. Is parenting. It's obviously, it depends on the age that you're talking about, because what I can talk about with my 4-year-old is very different than what you can talk to a 10-year-old about. And I've actually played with the idea of doing a follow-up to my book called like A Children's Guide to Capitalism, because I've seen a couple of books and I haven't really been satisfied with them. I think they either are so heavy-handed that it's like more than children should really have to handle, and they don't really fit, for children. Like I know for like my 4-year-old, like anytime they're like good guy, bad guy games, like he's really into Robin Hood, which is a good socialist hero. But every time we're like playing like any kind of good guy, bad guy games, inevitably it ends in some kind of negotiation where he convinces the bad guys to become good guys. Because there's something, inherently kind of idealistic about, children that have a worldview that is not made up of they're just being bad people, but a worldview that's more hopeful than a lot of us have wound up with. And that's a good thing. That hope is actually an instigator for change. Anyway, so there are books that I find are geared towards children, but they're, I believe, too heavy-handed and kind of depressing. And then there are books that are, basically, for lack of a better word, just this liberal, like, just be nice to each other. And if we just teach children to like be respectful, then that is, you know, what we need to do. And I think that's insufficient for another reason. So I actually wrote a book, I mean, not a book. I wrote an article for Jacobin that people could Google about how to talk to kids about politics. And my main, you know, I'm not any kind of an expert on it. I'm just a parent, you know, with my own opinions. But in my opinion, I think that the main framework that I use is one that to take children seriously. You know, my son is 4 years old, which is pretty young, but he understands a lot. And he takes very seriously like the ideas of wanting to change the world, and he notices a lot of things. And if you try not to talk about those things because you assume it's too much or whatever, then it leaves a very confusing worldview, where he sees a lot that's wrong, but we don't acknowledge it. And in that way, you sort of reinforce that it's okay. So we do talk about things, but I try to be very cognizant of paying attention to what he wants to talk about, and how much he can handle is you know, you can read by the questions that he raises. I try to answer all the questions that he has, rather than just going down my own road of explaining, you know, climatary disaster. I'm not going to get into that with a 4-year-old, but I do talk to him about why we need more trains in the world versus more cars, and things like that. So it's about thinking, and it's dependent on the age, and it's dependent on the individual child, about what is digestible, about what is it, the things that they're trying to understand, because children are always trying to understand and make sense of the world. And it's up to us to help them to make sense of it, and to emphasize, and this is the last thing I'll say, is to be constantly emphasizing that we're trying to change things, that nothing about the way our society is static. And that, I think, is a Marxist worldview, but it's also one that really fits with the kind of inherent hopefulness and idealism of children, that everything is in flux, that we and other people and people all over the world are constantly trying to make changes and make the world better. And that's what we emphasize in all our discussions, you know, with our son, about the things that are wrong are also the things that we're trying to fix. And here's why and how. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I look forward to the book when it comes out. Sarah, would you like to come in for the final contribution of the evening, if you'd like to?
Yeah, maybe quickly. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a question or a contribution, really, but you know, related to what you were just saying about children, I do think that, as well as talking about economics, we're not always very good at either analysing or describing how ideology works. And, you know, if we want people out on the streets, we have to convince them. Of course, sometimes there's a big element of fear, but I sometimes think we don't talk enough about how mystifying the arms of the state are, the media and ideas. And I was just very struck a couple of weeks ago. I saw some interesting tweets by a guy called Shamir Sani, who worked for the Leave campaign when he was quite young and was very taken with it, and eventually realised how horrible the Tories were. And and he was reminiscing, and one of the things he said was that they would literally go round repeating their own very narrow-minded ideas. So obviously they had to try and convince themselves of these ideas. Yet their machinery does it on a vast scale. And I wondered what more we can do, because we're obviously lacking something somewhere. And we often assert things about economics and what the bosses are doing, and we use shorthand a bit. I mean, I'm not saying we've been doing that this evening. Actually, I think it was a very good talk. But I do think we have to find better ways of sort of preparing our material and discussing and producing evidence and convincing people in a way that they can clock and doesn't just wash over them. I often talk to people, you know, who are not socialists, and there are lots of things that they just don't get because they don't have that conceptual framework. I'll leave it there. Thanks. It's very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hadas, would you like to just kind of finish off with a couple of minutes on Sarah's comment, if you feel able to?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very well said, and I don't know that I have a ton to add to it. I just think that that's really critical. I think, in particular, at this moment, you know, we're looking at a time when the so-called like millennial generation are coming into their political own, so to speak, and there's a real thirst for politics, a real thirst for making much more systemic change, and we want to be able to connect with that and not, you know, come in sort of like aliens with our own jargon and our own means of speaking. We want to be able to break things down as clearly and as accessibly as possible. That's what I've attempted to do in the book, is to make some contribution to that process, to talk about things in a way that is contemporary enough and is not lacking, and it is not based on like heavy-handed jargon enough to be able to try to connect with that newer and often younger radicalization with the deep well of Marxism, and to try to make that kind of learning organic, rather than sort of like heavy-handed from the outside. So I couldn't agree more. And I just want to thank everybody for a really fantastic discussion. I think it's been really good hearing everybody's not just questions but thoughts, and engaging in comradely debates and all the rest of it. I think this is exactly the political discussions that are necessary for us to be engaging with. So I really want to thank you all for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Hadas. Thank you for taking time out your day to speak to us this evening. It's very, very welcome, and congratulations on the sales of the book. I hope you sell many more, because it is a great title, and I hope that comrades that are on the call today will go out and purchase a copy, so that's a definite. And I hope that we'll be able to invite you back again in the not too distant future, and I'll send over a link for the talk once I put it up online, and we'll definitely share Neil's economics paper with you as well. So I'll grab your email address if I can, and we'll ping that over to you, and hopefully that'll stimulate some debate as well. So thank you all for attending this evening, everyone. The next Anti-Capitalist Resistance meeting is the Left Book Club group session that we have next Tuesday. So I hope as many of you can join us for that. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Hadas. Keep safe and have a happy holidays, and hopefully we will see you again soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.